This evening, Books and Books is very happy to welcome Mr. Neil J. Young and his new book, We Gather Together, The Religious Right and the Problem of Interfaith Politics. Mr. Young is a historian and independent scholar who previously taught at Princeton University. He holds a BA from Duke University and a PhD in U.S. history from Columbia University. His articles have appeared in American Quarterly, the Journal of Policy History, the New York Times, Slate, Huffington Post, and the Christian Science Monitor. We think we know the story of the birth of the religious right, that in the 1970s, mainly in response to Roe v. Wade, evangelicals and conservative Catholics put aside their long-standing historical prejudices and theological differences and joined forces to form a potent political movement that swept across the country. In this book, Mr. Young argues that almost none of this is true. He offers an alternative history of the religious right that upends these widely believed myths. Here to tell us more about it, please give a very warm welcome to Mr. Neil J. Young.
Hi. Good evening. Thanks for coming out tonight, and thank you for that introduction, which does a nice job of setting up my talk for today. This project began as a dissertation when I was at Columbia. I actually went to graduate school to be a 19th century Southern history, so it was a big surprise to find myself all of a sudden writing about a fairly recent, in terms of history, a fairly recent historical moment. As I was in graduate school, this was during the George W. Bush years, and a lot of historians were starting to ask questions about how to explain the Bush presidency, and particularly the prominence of religious and social conservatives. And there was just a kind of the first wave of historiography coming out about the religious right. And it tended to make this argument that religious conservatives became a unified political constituency in the 1970s and 80s, basically around these questions of abortion and the issues of the Equal Rights Amendment in the 70s. And so this was kind of the dominant narrative of the history that was coming out. And I wanted to investigate that and kind of push past that explanation and to go kind of deeper into the history, go further back into the history. And so I began my project in the 1950s. And one of the things I wanted to do was to write a history of the religious right, not so much as a political history, which is how most historians were treating it, as a political movement. And we can understand why they would be doing that, right? But to think about it as a religious history and a religious movement. These people, after all, are religious actors, primarily religious actors who are making political choices and are shaping American politics. But that kind of religious life and the religious history didn't seem to be very well spelled out in the literature, and that's what I really wanted to investigate. And in doing so, I found myself starting my story in the 1950s and thinking about how these three groups that I write about in my book, evangelicals, Catholics, and Mormons, came together. And again, the standard explanation was Roe v. Wade happens, right? The Equal Rights Amendment happens, and they find themselves on the same kind of side of the playing field politically. But what I found in pushing further back into the 1950s was that these groups started talking to each other about religious questions that they were having, questions about mainline Protestantism and the ecumenical movement that was coming out of a lot of liberal churches and seminaries, and other kind of theological questions that were really prominent at mid-century. And it was that initial conversation in the 1950s that I argue helped shape the political alliance that's built in the 1970s and 1980s. And so I'm making a very different argument than a lot of historians have been in terms of starting the story in the 1950s, but also in writing about the religious right as a much more fractious and a much more disunited group than they have typically been characterized. And so my book is really as much about organizing as it is about the ways in which that was a huge challenge for them, and in some ways an impossibility. And so my book really gets into these kind of fractures and these disagreements as much as it talks about political success and political achievements that they had. So for my reading today, even though I've said that I've started my book in the 1950s, I actually am going to read from my chapter about Ronald Reagan, because I think obviously Reagan remains this huge figure in American history and American politics, and it's this moment that I think continues to raise questions for historians. How do we explain the rise of Reagan? What does Reagan mean for American politics, and how does Reagan's administration and presidency shape the future of American politics? So I'll start there, and again, I make a different argument than historians have tended to make, that in the moment of Reagan, I don't see so much unity among religious conservatives as I see this as a point in which a lot of the tensions and a lot of the disagreements and a lot of the fracturing starts to emerge. Okay, this comes from my 7th chapter called The Promised Land. Reagan wins, exclaimed the headlines across the media outlets of the religious right in 1980. It was hard to show humility or patience after such a huge election they had helped bring about. But religious conservatives quickly learned their agenda wouldn't be the first priority of the Reagan White House. Instead, the White House explained Reagan first had to address the nation's poor economy and tackle the tax burden. But once the president's tax package passed, it became clear the Reagan administration would give little attention to the conservative moral issues the religious right had expected the new president to address. The journalist Lou Cannon, working on a biography of Reagan during his first administration, asked a presidential advisor what the White House planned to give the religious right. Symbolism, the staffer responded. Pointing to the blockbuster film The Godfather, the advisor explained the Reagan White House intended to follow the mafia don's philosophy. Hold your friends close, hold your enemies closer. He elaborated, we want to keep the moral majority types so close to us they can't move their arms. The Washington Post quoted a more high-ranking Reagan staffer who said the only way any religious right leaders could enter the White House would be through the back door. Another journalist covering the Reagan White House, Sidney Blumenthal, found the president's team practiced a tacit containment strategy, whereby key Senate leaders and White House staffers were encouraged to meet regularly with religious right operatives to discuss pressing concerns, so to give the appearance that work was being done on the issues without actually delivering on them in any substantive way. This would keep the religious right happy, or at least distractedly busy, while not eliciting the concerns of Reagan's larger, more secular support. Small gestures could be extended, like proposing a bill or on a tiny aspect of a larger social concern, or delivering a speech to a key religious right organization. But less effort would be done to see that such a bill would pass, or that a speech's promises would actually be carried out. Morton Blackwell, a presidential assistant, was responsible for looking after the religious right constituency, and given the charge to keep them, as Blumenthal explained, in a state of perpetual mobilization. The flaw in that strategy, Blumenthal noted, was that the White House served as an incubator for the movement it was trying to contain. Of course, with religious right operatives, Blackwell presented a different explanation of the White House's strategy. In a letter to a moral majority leader, Blackwell explained that the White House would approach the religious rights agenda through a tactic of what it called incrementalism. The fact is that it works, Blackwell contended. It is unrealistic to expect to undo 50 years of bad increments in 1 year or even in one presidential term. A foolish belief in the possibility of total, instant victory is a prescription for unrealistic hopes and early disillusionment at the grassroots. The first disappointment the president's evangelical supporters admitted concerned the administration's lack of a sizable evangelical presence, particularly since Reagan had made campaign promises that he would staff evangelicals within his administration in proportion to their representation in the American public. Now, the idea that some 40% of the Reagan administration would be made up of evangelicals was preposterous, but the paltry numbers of the paltry numbers of evangelicals who actually made it into the administration must have seemed even more ridiculous to those watching closely. Two scholars later counted only 4 evangelicals among Reagan's 31 cabinet appointees, with Secretary of the Interior James Watt being the only evangelical appointed in Reagan's first cabinet. Reagan did appoint Moral Majority Executive Director Robert Billings as his Assistant Secretary of Education for non-public schools, but he was soon removed from the position because of protests from Catholic educators who were worried about a fundamentalist Protestant having so much power over the federal government's relationship with parochial schools. While more evangelicals were scattered throughout the lower ranks of the White House administration, it was no presence of note. But this hardly tempered evangelical expectations. One frustrated evangelical in the White House attracted controversy when she told a reporter that Reagan's close advisors should either get saved or get out. Evangelicals' next disappointment came when Reagan nominated Sandra Day O'Connor to the Supreme Court in his first year in office. In running for the presidency, Reagan had courted key religious right operatives by vowing to nominate only committed pro-life jurists to the nation's highest court. His winning of the National Right to Life Committee's endorsement, in fact, had been secured in 2 private meetings with the group's president, where he had promised her just that. O'Connor then was a startling choice. Pro-lifers dug up O'Connor's voting records from her time as an Arizona state legislator, and they found a worrisome history of pro-choice votes. Reagan's shocking intention, in the words of a Christian Action Council fundraising letter, to nominate O'Connor seemed an especially insulting move to pro-life activists, and anti-abortion newspapers and magazines decried the president's move. At the White House, 50 leaders from various religious right organizations complained to Morton Blackwell of their growing sense that given his actions, the president didn't, quote, think this coalition contributed significantly to his election. Internally, the religious right faced challenges of its own making. Importantly, for all the talk of an ecumenical movement on behalf of conservative social issues, the religious right operated largely along denominational lines in its dealings with the Reagan White House. At the leadership ranks, religious right organizations sometimes coordinated with each other, but more often worked alone or in partnership, especially evangelical and fundamentalist groups, with like-minded believers. This had been the case in the run-up to the 1980 election, but divided operations in a campaign season seemed the most logical way to mobilize diverse constituencies. The conviction among conservative Catholics, Mormons, and evangelicals that Ronald Reagan was the man they needed in the White House to deliver on their goals had united their divided efforts. Once Reagan assumed the presidency, these disparate strands of conservative Christianity would come together as the bloc representing traditionalism and religious values to make sure the president turned the nation back to God and delivered on their agenda. While there were moments of cooperation and common cause within the religious right during the Reagan years, far more often the various components of the network worked in isolation, opening up divisions even within shared issues and working in direct opposition on other issues they had never really discussed. The religious right foundered at what could have been its best moment, riven by theological disagreements that yielded political consequences and often divided by different political objectives, reflecting their unique theological convictions. What emerged during the Reagan years was, at best, a loose coalition of religious conservatives, frequently fraught with dissension, disagreement, and the possibility of dispersion. For a White House that hesitated over aligning itself too closely with what often appeared a radioactive religious right, the divisions within the network proved a useful scapegoat. Rather than working to smooth over disagreements and broker compromises, Reagan officials largely sat back and allowed the infighting and disunity to continue, then pointed to the chaos as a way to avoid the responsibility of leadership or to explain away disappointing legislative setbacks. On the religious right's 2 major objectives for the Reagan presidency, school prayer and abortion, the network's fractured nature helped doom policy objectives that had always been a formidable project. And on other issues of national concern, including welfare reform and the nuclear arms race, evangelicals, Catholics, and Mormons took differing positions that demonstrated their political divergence and challenged the notion of a conservative ecumenism. Now, in the rest of the chapter, I go into each of these issues and talk about how these moments or these opportunities for political victory around these important causes, and these causes that many religious conservatives thought that Reagan would be the great champion of and that would get something done about, namely abortion and school prayer, but other issues that I explore in the chapter, that they really fall apart. And one of the explanations that I give for that is that this movement is so kind of new in terms of its political organizing and its political advocacy. And so in the late 70s, as they're coming together as kind of a coherent political constituency to bring Reagan into office, it's quite easy for them to imagine getting stuff done on shared political issues, so abortion or school prayer. But once Reagan is in office, and these things have to be tackled not just in terms of politics, but have to be tackled legislatively and through the political process, the movement really falls apart because you see these groups not really unifying, but in fact kind of scurrying to their own corners and pursuing their own political and their own legislative and legal strategies that are sometimes in odds with each other. And a lot of these have to do with different theological positions, say on abortion, that the Catholic Church is putting forward a political strategy that will allow for no exceptions, while as Mormons and evangelicals are more willing to work at kind of political compromises about the question of abortion. Or in school prayer, you have different activists realizing that this idea of a constitutional amendment to restore school prayer is a nice idea, but how do you actually do that? How do you write a piece of legislation that appeases everyone and in fact doesn't kind of offend or put your own kind of religious values in jeopardy? Because what you don't want is your evangelical child saying a prayer that might sound too Catholic or too Mormon. And so these issues kind of fall apart at the policy and the legislative era and through the Reagan administration. I'm going to jump ahead and read one last section in my book in light of our upcoming Iowa Caucus, which we're just a few days away from. And in my last chapter of the book, I write about the 2008 Iowa Caucus. And I think that this moment is kind of fun for us to think about in light of some of the things that are happening right now in Iowa and in light of the big vote that's coming in a few days. Coming shortly after Christmas, the Iowa Caucus commingled with preparations for the holiday. Republican candidates, particularly concerned with capturing support from Iowa's large base of religious conservatives, sprinkled Merry Christmas tidings amid their campaign speeches, spreading not only a typical Yuletide greeting, but also coyly tapping into conservative Christian fears, stoked by right-wing media outlets each December about a liberal war on Christmas. To say Merry Christmas was not merely a holiday pleasantry, it was another lob to the secular left in the nation's ongoing culture war. As the nation looked on to see who would emerge victorious from Iowa, Mike Huckabee pretended to pause from the campaign with a television advertisement that drew Iowans back to the more important Christmas season. Huckabee's ad, What Matters, found the candidate sitting in front of a Christmas tree in a warmly lit living room. As the soft strains of Silent Night played in the background, Huckabee, dressed in a comfortable red sweater, wondered aloud if those watching were worn out from all the commercials playing, especially those about politics. I don't blame you, Huckabee commiserated. Amid all the rush and commotion of the season, Huckabee suggested that, quote, sometimes it's nice to pull aside from all of that and just remember that what really matters is the celebration of the birth of Christ. Most observers saw the ad for what it was, a political move disguised as a non-political offering, a candidate's attempt to assert the sacred over the political for his own electoral gain. But a smaller crowd spotted something more subliminal and subversive in Huckabee's commercial. As the camera panned across the living room, a bookcase over Huckabee's shoulder appeared to have been lighted in just such a way to make one section of the shelves glow as a bright white cross, standing out against an otherwise darkly lit background. Instantly, Huckabee's Christmas ad grabbed all the coverage of the Iowa campaign. The cable news outlets assembled the usual suspects of pundits and partisans to debate again whether or not a cross floated behind Huckabee's head as they repeatedly replayed the commercial. Huckabee expectedly claimed innocence, laughing off the controversy, and tried to steer the conversation back to his War on Christmas talking points. I know this is probably a very controversial thing, but may I say to you, Merry Christmas, Huckabee took to exclaiming in his speeches throughout Iowa in the days that followed. But a growing crowd started to contend that Huckabee's ad had crossed the line. Predictably, Democrats had a field day with the ad, many seeing it as yet more proof of the theocratic intentions of the Republican Party. Some of Huckabee's fellow challengers for the GOP nomination also jumped at the chance to use the ad against Huckabee, now surging ahead in the Iowa polls. Ron Paul, the libertarian, said the ad reminded him of the famous Sinclair Lewis line, "When fascism comes to this country, it will be wrapped in a flag carrying a cross." Paul growled that the floating cross was Huckabee's attempt to suggest he was the only Christian in the race. Many GOP insiders saw the ad as embarrassing and a distraction from a campaign that ought to focus on serious economic and foreign policy concerns. Peggy Noonan devoted an entire article of her Wall Street Journal column to the floating cross controversy, deeming it creepy. But Huckabee's fiercest critics came from non-evangelical religious conservatives, most of whom shared his traditional social positions, but recoiled at the cross imagery they interpreted as a dog whistle to evangelical voters, rather than an expression of conservative Christian ecumenism. Bill Donahue, president of the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Liberties, took to the morning television show Fox and Friends to accuse the ad of that very sinister purpose. "You know what?" Donahue scolded. "Sell yourself on your issues, not on what your religion is." The Catholic news network EWTN pondered the ad and suggested that Huckabee had, quote, exploited his faith. Among Republican religious conservatives, however, Mormons reacted most negatively to Huckabee's Christmas ad. Modern Mormons generally avoid the symbol of the cross, and yet this is yet another practice that Mormon critics pointed to as evidence of Mormonism's non-Christian status. Mormon buildings never display a cross. Mormons never wear a cross around their necks. As LDS President Gordon B. Hinckley had explained in 2005, Mormons saw the cross as, quote, a symbol of the dying Christ, while our message is a declaration of the living Christ. If Huckabee's Christmas ad indeed contained a planted cross in it, it was unlikely that Huckabee meant anything more by it than an expression of his Christian faith, but Mormon viewers were convinced the cross, especially coming from Huckabee, was an intentional anti-Mormon gesture. Leaders of the LDS Church, unsurprisingly, remained mute on the floating cross controversy. Romney's presence in the race meant LDS officials were particularly committed to appearing neutral during the campaign season. But the Mormon blogosphere erupted with chatter over Huckabee's anti-Mormon Christmas ad. As one blogger from Utah wrote, Huckabee's commercial with its anti-Mormon cross was, quote, just the latest of his stunts to try and convince the voting populace that Mitt Romney is a member of a cult. Though Huckabee offered the most socially conservative positions of the major Republican candidates for the 2008 election, positions that marked him clearly to the right of Mitt Romney and aligned Huckabee more closely with most Mormons politically, Mormons resisted supporting Huckabee, not only because of strong allegiances they felt towards Romney, but also because of a growing sense among them of Huckabee's unabashed anti-Mormonism. Even before the Christmas commercial could confirm those fears, Huckabee had a number of strikes against him as far as Mormons were concerned. As a former Southern Baptist pastor, Huckabee's church affiliation represented one of the most stridently anti-Mormon denominations in LDS minds. Mormons knew well the history of Southern Baptist LDS relations, and they couldn't help but see Huckabee, a man who had not only pastored a church, but also served as president of the Arkansas Baptist Convention before becoming governor, as somehow complicit in propagating a Southern Baptist anti-Mormonism. An extended profile of Huckabee in the New York Times magazine offered additional proof for his questionable reputation among Mormons. Just days before the release of Huckabee's Christmas ad, the Sunday magazine's cover article, The Huckabee Factor, legitimated the one-time dark horse candidate who now seemed poised to win Iowa, and perhaps even the GOP nomination. But a small comment Huckabee made soon became the only topic of conversation among those watching the race. Asked by the reporter if he considered Mormonism a cult, Huckabee feigned ignorance. "I think it's a religion," Huckabee responded. "I really don't know much about it." Had Huckabee stopped there, his comment would have likely attracted no attention. It was a doubtful claim, of course. Huckabee, as a Southern Baptist pastor and state convention president, would have encountered Baptist teachings about Mormonism in various spots throughout his ministry, including seminary. As one Baptist pastor from North Carolina had recently explained to a different reporter, part of his training for the ministry had involved studying Mormonism in a course called Cults and False Religions. It was very likely Huckabee had done the same while in seminary, and even if he hadn't, it would have been almost impossible to miss the steady stream of anti-Mormon materials the Southern Baptist Convention had produced through the years. In fact, Huckabee had delivered the keynote speech at the Southern Baptist Convention's annual meeting in 1998 in Salt Lake City, which had given special attention to educating Baptists about the false religion of Mormonism. Yet rather than maintaining an air of unfamiliarity, Huckabee pushed his conversation with the Times reporter to an unexpected place. "Don't Mormons believe that Jesus and the devil are brothers?" Predictably, Huckabee's suggestive question drew outrage from all corners. The LDS Church rushed to clarify Mormon theology regarding the devil in the aftermath of Huckabee's words. An LDS spokesperson explained to the Associated Press, "Satan is the exact opposite of who Christ is and who he stands for." But the website of Mormonism Research Ministry, which is an evangelical group devoted to converting LDS members to evangelical Christianity, pointed out that the LDS spokesperson's comments still hadn't addressed the question of Jesus and Satan's relationship in Mormon theology. And it cited an impressive collection of LDS scripture, documents, and statements that describe them as siblings, including a passage from an early LDS sermon that described the devil as, quote, "the mighty Lucifer, the great prince of the angels, and the brother of Jesus." Though the controversy hurt Huckabee's reputation, it couldn't dim his prospects in Iowa. Buoyed by evangelical voters who dominated the state's Republican Party, Mike Huckabee pulled off an upset victory in the Iowa Caucus. But Huckabee's aspirations and those of Romney soon grew dim as Senator John McCain of Arizona marched to the GOP nomination, and in doing so, put to rest for the moment questions about the evangelical Mormon political relationship. So I'll stop there, but that's a big theme of this book, this long-standing tension between evangelicals and the Mormon Church that I chart from the 1950s to the present, and becomes incredibly potent and powerful, obviously during Romney's 2 runs for the White House in 2008 and 2012. And there's a really interesting history there of something that's very much changing over time, and a real kind of evangelical reevaluation or a kind of a changing of the relationship there that you see really coming alive in 2012 in a way that allows for kind of Romney to be the nominee, and for the base of the Republican Party, for the evangelical base, to get behind him as the presidential nominee from the GOP. So I'll stop there and open up to the audience for any questions that you might have.
a trivial question. In the 50s, wasn't that when In God We Trust got put on coins? What's the history of that, and how does that relate to the political movement that then seemed to coalesce around that time?
Right. There's a great book out from a colleague of mine from Princeton, Kevin Cruz, that I would recommend called One Nation Under God, that really gets into the story of In God We Trust and how it's put on our currency, and how under God is brought into the Pledge of Allegiance. And he makes an argument, and this is why it's not as much a part of my book, that actually isn't that's not a movement from political conservatives or from religious conservatives. That's actually a movement from kind of a broad swath of Americans who are doing that because of the Cold War. And so they see this action as not about kind of religious or political conservatism, but about anti-communism. And so there was actually a broad swath of Americans from kind of across the political spectrum that were behind those decisions. But I do think it sets up a certain terrain, and perhaps also sets up certain ideas about the nation as having kind of Christian origins and things like that, that become obviously incredibly important in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, because a lot of religious conservatives will point to things like that as kind of evidence of the nation's Christian status and Christian heritage and Christian tradition, and of course those were developments that were of fairly recent origin at that point. Yes.
Donald Trump. I think probably until 9 months ago, nobody could have imagined that he had a religious hair on his head. And just today, I think, or maybe it was yesterday, he secured Jerry Falwell's endorsement, Jerry Falwell Jr.'s endorsement, Sarah Palin's endorsement, obviously, within the past few days. He claims to carry in his embrace the evangelical voter and evangelical causes. And obviously, to the outside observer, that doesn't really square with his entire life story. And I think there was a piece just in the Times today about how he used to really gloat about his extramarital affairs, and obviously he took positions that were directly contrary to the right. How is it that you think that he has been able to garner the support of the people that he seemed to have taken diametrically opposed positions to in this race?
It's a great question. I was hoping I was going to get a Trump question, so thank you for that. At the same time, I think none of us really know how to explain Trump, and this is like one of the most complicated developments I think that we've seen in American politics in quite some time. I don't think any of us expected to still be talking about Trump at this point in the race. I mean, I think everyone thought that this was some flash in the and I think maybe even Trump himself thought that, that he wasn't going to last past September. But here we are, just a few days from Iowa Caucus voting, and it looks like he's going to win it. And a big question is, what is Trump's relationship with the religious right, or how is he doing so well among them? And I think in some ways that remains to be seen. I think we've got to see a lot more voting data that'll come out of the caucuses and primaries to see if this is really just a protest vote that Christian conservatives are registering with kind of the media right now, or if they're actually going to show up and vote for him. So that remains to be seen. But nevertheless, where we are at this moment, the fact that he is the front runner depends in part on support from Christian conservatives. But what I think is really interesting here is it's a very divided support, or at least there's a lot of divides within religious conservatives, and that's what I've been watching most closely over the past couple of months, because in a lot of ways it speaks to the central argument of my book, that the religious right is a much more divided and fractious constituency than we've normally talked about it. It's not the monolith that we often see it to be, and so the big divide that is really interesting to me, and that I think we do see right now, is a real divide between what I would call like evangelical leadership and evangelical laity. So evangelical, like grassroots people on the ground. Most evangelical leaders, Jerry Falwell Jr. aside and a few others, have since the beginning of this race devoted almost all of their attention to opposing Trump's candidacy. And there have been very, very concerted efforts from all sorts of figures to kind of stop this political movement, if we want to call it that, from happening. But it doesn't seem to be trickling down to kind of evangelical laypersons, or at least not in the way that we've seen kind of that messaging happening between leadership and laity in past election cycles. Again, it's very divided, and I think Trump's numbers among evangelicals are not nearly as strong as previous Republican candidates, but they're strong enough to be doing something for him that's keeping him in this race and keeping him at the front of the race. So and as a historian, I hate to make predictions. I'd rather make arguments about the past. But since we're so close to what I think is going to be his win, or at least close to a win in Iowa and perhaps in New Hampshire as well, I think the interesting thing for me is to think about what this means for the religious right and kind of the future of the religious right. At every election cycle, and particularly after Democratic victories, there's always like a million think pieces that are written in newspapers and magazines that this, such and such victory or such and such defeat spells the end of the religious right. And of course, those are always wrong. I mean, the religious right as a political movement is not going away any more than any other political movement is once it's faced some sort of setback. That's all political movements face that, right? But, and I think that Donald Trump, this moment, I would argue that it represents the biggest crisis for the religious right in the last 20 to 30 years. And that's what I think is so fascinating here, because we've normally thought about kind of crisis moments as being about their political defeat to the kind of the other side, right? When Clinton wins and is reelected, those are moments of political crisis. When Obama wins and is reelected, that's a moment that's perceived as a political crisis for the religious right. But what I see as Trump's possible winning of this nomination, despite or maybe because of a very fractured evangelical constituency, I think that spells really the biggest crisis for the religious right in the last 20 to 30 years. And so that's what's fascinating to me, is that this greatest challenge, this greatest crisis, whatever we want to call it, is coming not from, again, the other side and the victory of the other side, but from internal circumstances within, that perhaps the religious right is going to have to really think about what it is and how it moves forward because of developments within its own party, or at least the party that it's most closely affiliated with.
Ask a follow-up?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry.
I don't know if I really explained why he's gaining traction with voters that you wouldn't expect him to.
You said about the evangelical leadership.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think the reasons are that he's had that kind of success? Is it just political convenience? Because I agree with you. Obviously, it would represent a crisis moment for the evangelical right. But the interesting thing is that after, and this is all reported through the lens of New York Times, obviously, after the convocation at Liberty University,
right,
the biggest news was that he had let out a few curse words during his speech.
Right.
And there's an anonymous blog at Liberty, and the students took to the airwaves to voice their discontent with him swearing. But that was the extent of it.
Right.
So I don't know if that's just sort of an implicit endorsement of what Jerry, their fearless leader, told them, or if maybe people sort of just were falling into line. I don't know, but it'd be interesting to see at least what you think about why Jerry and people like Sarah as well are sort of jumping on board.
Right, and the other thing that he did at Liberty that was, drew a lot of laughter at the time and a lot of kind of mocking afterwards is he called 2 Corinthians 2 Corinthians, right, which spoke to how familiar he was with the Bible. He purports to be his favorite book. I think again we need to see how these votes actually shake out, because I think that's when we'll know the most about what Trump really means and who is actually supporting him. But right now the polling suggests that he has, again, he has a significant support among religious conservatives, a support that would be more than we would expect. I think, if anything, what it's doing is showing the diversity within evangelicalism. And again, this is a population of some, people we have a hard time knowing for sure, but say about 40 million Americans. And they span a broad swath of denominations, of class, of region. There is so much diversity within this group that we've tended to think of them monolithically because they've been such a supportive bloc for the Republican Party. But this is a moment that actually speaks to that diversity. And that I think what we're finding, and I'm waiting for sociologists to like release some really good data that they've been hopefully tracking all of this all along and has figured out kind of, who are actually these supporters. But I think our kind of initial reading of this is it tends to be coming more from the fundamentalist wing of evangelicalism and from kind of lower class, lower white working class supporters, and I think that's going to be really important for us to think about. What are the class dimensions that are work in this larger political body of the religious right, and is Trump kind of finally revealing some of those class and maybe even regional divides? So I hope that answers some of what you were getting at.
Neil,
Yes.
Where are the Catholics in this fight? So you mentioned sort of the two more upstart religions, call it if you're Catholic. Where are, I guess they have Bush and I guess Marco Rubio,
Right.
although Marco Rubio was a Mormon and I guess he's now an evangelical.
Right. Well, yeah. So where are Catholics in this election cycle?
Yes.
I mean, I think the interesting thing is they haven't been much of the story, and I don't totally know why. As you point out, there are several candidates that you would, and Santorum was around too. I think he's still in the race, or he was for a time being. But there have been kind of candidates that you would think that would have maybe a Catholic constituency backing them up to make them kind of a stronger candidate. I don't know, and I'm quite confused about that. The reporting has not really been there on Catholic voters, right, in this election cycle. I think, and I certainly haven't seen anything about Trump doing well among them, though I suppose he is, just as he seems to be doing, okay with every demographic group. But I think it's surprising to me that someone like Ted Cruz is not going after the Catholic vote as a way of kind of shoring up his nomination and of moving ahead of Trump here, because Cruz seems to only be going after evangelical voters, and Trump and Cruz seem to be in this this race to capture the evangelical vote, which again is certainly an important constituency, particularly in Iowa. But I don't understand why Cruz isn't seeking to broaden his appeal with more direct with more direct kind of messaging or targeting of Catholic voters. But I think that they're kind of that's a mystery that still hasn't really clarified itself yet in this election cycle. Yes.
Could it be that the LA Times is right and it's really, it comes down to genetics? That there's one group of people that will vote for a particular point of view, whether they're a religion or not a religion. It's a joke.
Okay. I haven't read that piece. That sounds more sociological or psychological than historical. But I mean, actually, there are historical patterns that kind of point to that as well. I don't know. I think that everyone right now is very much scratching their heads about this election, and I think a lot of us are hoping for maybe different reasons that things will get a little bit clearer after Americans start actually voting in the next couple of weeks. But this is one of the most, I think this is one of the most kind of confusing and complicated elections we've seen in a while, but one in which I do think is kind of revealing a lot of the arguments of my book about the fractured nature of conservatism, because one of the kind of standard historiographic arguments of American conservatism, that means arguments that historians make, has been that conservatism is the unified kind of its unity has been the key to its success, and that liberals or the left has always been this mess, that's like always internally fighting each other, that can't get its different constituencies together, and that falls apart under its own doing, as opposed to the right. And you can imagine how that argument made sense through the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, but that kind of argument has really has really been challenged by certainly the last 8 years, and I think as historians have kind of gone back into the 80s and 90s, and even further back, they realized actually there were problems within conservatism to begin with, problems within the movement to begin with. Those were there from the beginning, and that those kind of fissures and those fractures maybe took a while to emerge, but they too, just like the left, are showing that those divisions and those internal skirmishes are revealing themselves now on kind of the national political stage. Yes.
When Bloomberg essentially admitted that he was concerned, what was your reaction?
Sorry.
What was your reaction to that? It wasn't an announcement. It wasn't a press release, but it was clearly with his permission that he is saying, I may enter the race.
Bloomberg.
And I was wondering how that struck you and what it did with the main theses that you hold.
Well, if anything, I think it definitely points to something I think a lot of Americans feel, that the two-party system isn't working for America, and so someone as a third-party candidate, I think, is speaking or trying to tap into that sentiment, and you can imagine how that sentiment will become all the stronger should Trump win the nomination, and if Sanders wins the nomination, right? That's going to, I think, allow a lot of Americans to question, or at least feel like less attached to the two-party system and the two-party structure, and that someone like Bloomberg as a third-party candidate will be attractive to them. I tend to not really take this very seriously, because I think we've heard this story before, and his name has definitely been brought up in other election cycles. This definitely sounded like more of a more serious story than maybe some of the examples or some of the stories in the past, in that he was, as you say, kind of putting that word out there unofficially. But from everything I understand, it depends on Clinton not getting the nomination, and I think that's probably unlikely, even as Sanders is giving her obviously a pretty good race right now. But I don't anticipate him actually entering the race. I don't see that actually happening. I think in some ways a lot of this is like a New York media story, that because they like to talk about Bloomberg, and this is fun for them.
He had the caveat that it had to also appear to him that Hillary couldn't win.
Right. Yeah, there were a lot of caveats attached to that, and so then you have to wonder, is this more about, again, a media story and less about kind of an actual political plan or actual, a strategy in place? Yes.
In your book, you give a lot more attention to Mormons than perhaps some other scholars have.
Yeah.
To talk about how you decided to add them and what they added to the conversation.
Sure. So that's a good question, and one that I really enjoyed working on in this book, because the literature on the religious right has tended to say, again, the success of the religious right depended on evangelicals, Catholics, and Mormons coming together. But after they mention Mormons once in the introduction, they kind of fall out of these books. And so I wanted to take Mormon political history seriously and to really investigate that story and to bring them into the narrative of the religious right as equal players, or at least as players alongside evangelicals and Catholics in the rise of modern conservatism since the 1950s. And so what I found was that, not surprisingly, the Mormon Church and Mormons had been incredibly politically active, obviously in Utah and throughout the Intermountain West for most of their history. But in the 1960s and 70s, they really started asserting themselves on the national political stage, for the first time really around the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s. And they find great success in that movement. And then they're very active in particularly around anti-gay measures that are happening in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s at the local and state level, but in a way that helps us kind of understand and appreciate their prominence in the same-sex marriage battles of 2008, 2012, their role in Proposition 8 in California and stuff like that. So there's a rich and a very active history of Mormon political conservative activism that I was really fascinated by and was really excited to bring into this book. And in doing so, I think one of the things that it helps me do is not only just kind of add another cast of characters, but also to help think about religious conservatism as not a regional phenomenon, which is how it's often been treated, that this is, you know, something that's coming out of the South or the Midwest, right? But it's thinking about religious conservatism in politics as a national phenomenon, because you think about, you know, the Mormon political force in the West, but also in realizing how politically powerful Mormons have been in places like you might not expect, like Florida and Virginia and Massachusetts, and that's happening through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so I think it helps give my book a national scope that was really missing in a lot of the religious right literature. Yes.
Well, I have a question. I'm not from here originally, so maybe you can help me understand. Most Republicans, they believe in small government versus Democrats, they believe in big government. That's the theory. So I'd like to understand why most of the religious institutions, they relate more to the Republican, which believe in small government versus Democrats that believe in big governments. Because big government usually help the poor, the people in need, the minorities, women, and so on, versus a small government that believe in business, entrepreneurs, and so on. So I'd like to understand why, if I'm religious or I belong to any kind of religion, I tend to vote Republican.
Well, first of all, I think that's a great question. It's a big question. I'll try to get to some of it. I think it's important to remember that Democrats have an incredibly active and powerful religious constituencies themselves. Catholic Democrats have long been a very powerful political players in the nation. African Americans, which are our most religious demographic in America, are overwhelmingly, our most how did I start that? African Americans, who are our most religious demographic in America, are overwhelmingly associated with the Democratic Party. So I think it's important to remember kind of the religious politics of the left. In terms of, why do so many conservative Christians align themselves with the Republican Party, I think a lot of it is that a feeling that that small government allows for citizens to be more personally active on issues like poverty. I can't remember some of the other things you said, but let's stick to poverty. And I actually write about that in my chapter about Reagan, where this is one of the big issues that breaks evangelicals and Catholics apart during the Reagan years, because the Catholic Church is attacking Reagan's anti-welfare program and anti-welfare plans and his tax policies, because Catholics want a much more active federal government, one that's much more devoted to helping the poor through kind of government networks. And evangelicals at the time, and I think still today, are saying, we want to attack poverty, we want to address poverty, but we don't believe that the government is the right way to do it. So there's a philosophical divide there that I think is important, and that obviously has political consequences. I think one of the interesting things, though, is how does the Republican Party become the party of kind of social conservatism? Because you don't have to go back that far to think of the Republican Party as much more a libertarian party, right? So in the 70s, if you are pro-life, or maybe I'll say it this way, in the 70s, if you're pro-choice, you're much more likely to be a Republican than to be a Democrat. The pro-life movement is in the Democratic Party. It's again, mostly because it's coming through the Catholic network and Catholic Democrats. And the Republican Party is the party that's supporting Planned Parenthood, and that's bringing about abortion reform in different states, and that isn't working in opposition to Roe v. Wade until late in the 1970s, and that's a result of many factors that I get into in here at length, but I think is kind of worth remembering, that in some ways a lot of these things that we talk about they don't have that long of a history. And that's kind of that was a fun thing for me to discover in writing this book.
I didn't understand your answer. You were classifying different groups as pro-democratic, pro-republican. It sounded to me like you were making 3 or 4 changes in my thinking, if I heard you correctly. It seems to me that the separating issue that I find is abortion, and that the parties have been pretty steady in that. And the evangelicals, that's the issue for
Right.
them. And the only thing where you might have some ambivalence is, as you mentioned, with Catholics who have a normal attachment to the Democratic Party. But I'm not sure, after speaking to all of my friends who are Catholic, that they feel quite as strongly as they're supposed to.
Right. Just to hopefully clarify, the complicated arrangement I was talking about was really just limited to the 1970s. By the 1980s, you have both parties firmly attached to their positions of, pro-life, pro-choice, however you want to call it, anti-abortion, pro-choice. But in the 1970s, it's a messy political playing field, and you have people kind of scattered on all sides. And there's a series of events that happen through the 70s and early 80s to attach each parties to both positions quite, as you say now, quite stridently and strongly. But that wasn't the case at the beginning, and that's what I kind of wanted to get at in that answer.
Part of one of your theses, my daughter is an evangelical, and she does not consider the Church of Latter-day Saints as being Christian.
Right.
She doesn't consider it a Christian church.
Right.
She makes a point of it not being Christian.
Right.
And I'm not sure where she stands on Catholics.
Well, that's the big theme of this book is in these different Christian groups and how they regard each other religiously and how that ultimately shaped this political alliance that emerges.
Thank you.
Are we good?
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here tonight.
All right, folks, if there are no more questions, then a note to our internet audience watching at home. Still time to call the number on your screen, and we can ship a copy of We Gather Together to wherever you are in the U.S. free of charge. For those of you here in the house, we have the book for sale at the counter in the front room over there. Neil's going to be signing here at the table to the left of the podium, and this has been such a fascinating presentation. Please give another hand to Neil J. Young. Thank you very much. Thank you, Neil.